The wind was the first to speak of the violence to come. For an hour it had whispered, a low moan that slid through the tall prairie grass. Now it screamed. Elias Thorne felt the change not just in his ears, but in the hollow of his bones. The pressure in the air had collapsed, a great weight lifted from the world, only to be replaced by something far more menacing. He pulled the collar of his sheepskin coat tighter around his neck and glanced at the sky. It was no longer blue, but a bruised, churning slate grey that seemed to sink lower with every passing second. His horse, Copper, shifted nervously beneath him. The animal's breath plumed in the unnaturally frigid air, his ears swiveling, his eyes wide. Copper knew, just as Elias knew. The land itself was holding its breath. The usual chatter of prairie dogs was gone. The hawks that normally circled high above were nowhere to be seen. There was only the shriek of the wind and the oppressive, silent waiting. Elias had seen skies like this before, in his years as a cavalry scout, tracking men who did not want to be found across the vast, empty landscapes of the West. This was a killer sky. "Time to go, boy," Elias said, his voice a low rumble. He nudged Copper with his heels, and the horse needed no further encouragement. He broke into a powerful canter, his hooves thudding against the hardening earth. The first flakes of snow began to fall. They were not the soft, gentle flakes of a winter postcard. They were tiny, hard pellets of ice, flung by the wind with such force they stung Elias's exposed cheeks like thrown sand. Within minutes, the world dissolved. The horizon vanished, consumed by a roiling wall of white. The familiar contours of the land, the gentle roll of the hills, the dark line of the distant creek bed, all of it was erased. There was only the storm, a living entity of wind and ice. Elias navigated by instinct, by the feel of the ground beneath Copper's hooves, by a mental map burned into his memory. He was not aiming for the small, vulnerable cabin he had sold last spring. He was aiming for a place the townsfolk of Prairie Ridge had derided for months. He was aiming for home. He saw it just as he began to fear he had missed it. A low, dark slit in the side of a snow-dusted knoll. The entrance was almost invisible, designed to be overlooked. He swung down from the saddle, his limbs already stiff with cold. He worked the heavy, iron-banded door, his fingers clumsy inside their thick mittens. The wind tore at him, trying to rip him from his footing. With a final, desperate heave, the door swung inward, revealing a yawning darkness. He led Copper inside, the horse's shod hooves clattering on a stone floor. Elias threw his weight against the door, and with a deep groan of protesting wood, it boomed shut. The shriek of the wind was instantly severed, replaced by a profound, muffled silence. The only sound was his own ragged breathing and the soft snort of his horse. They were safe. They were inside Thorne's Folly. 6 months earlier, Elias Thorne had stood in the office of Sheriff Brody. A survey map of the county was spread across the sheriff's cluttered desk. Elias placed a calloused finger on a small, insignificant rise of land labeled Miller's Knoll. "There," he said. "I'm building there." Sheriff Brody, a man whose authority came from a badge and a belief in the established way of things, leaned back in his chair. "Good piece of land, Thorne, sheltered from the west wind. Miller was a fool to sell it so cheap." "I'm not building on it," Elias clarified, his voice flat and even. "I'm building in it. I'm going to excavate 20 feet into the north face and build a sod-roofed lodge. Dug in. Anchored." Brody stared at him. The sheriff's face, normally set in a look of mild impatience, shifted to one of genuine disbelief. "A hole?" You want to live in a hole in the ground? For God's sake, Thorn, this is Dakota territory, not some savage wilderness. We have a sawmill. We build proper houses here, with clapboard siding and pitched roofs. We're civilized. Elias met the sheriff's gaze without flinching. I was a scout for the 3rd Cavalry for 12 years. I've spent winters in places that would make this prairie feel like a summer picnic. I've seen what a real blizzard can do. Not a snowstorm, Sheriff, a blizzard. When the wind blows so hard it scours the paint off a wagon, and the snow comes down so fine you breathe it into your lungs and drown. He leaned forward, his voice dropping slightly. A proper house, as you call it, is a sail in that wind. It's a box full of heat that bleeds into the cold from 100 tiny cracks. The wind finds those cracks. The cold finds them. I've seen entire families frozen solid in their beds inside their proper houses. The earth is the best insulation there is. It holds the warmth. It blunts the wind. It doesn't burn, and it doesn't collapse. Brody simply shook his head, a small, condescending smile playing on his lips. Listen, Thorn, I know you mountain men have your ways, but things are different now. We have stoves, we have coal. We don't need to live like badgers. He waved a dismissive hand. It's your land. You can dig to China for all I care. Just don't be surprised when people start calling you the Mole Man of Prairie Ridge. The sheriff's prediction proved accurate. Word of Elias's project spread through the small town like a grass fire. When he went to the general store to purchase shovels, a heavy-duty winch, and lengths of chain, the murmurs followed him down the aisles. The men who gathered around the pot-bellied stove fell silent when he entered, then resumed their conversations with poorly suppressed chuckles as he left. Heard Thorn's digging his own grave, one of them quipped, loud enough for Elias to hear as the door swung shut behind him. The laughter that followed was sharp and clear in the cool spring air. They saw his foresight as foolishness, his experience as eccentricity. They lived in a world of straight lines and square corners, of plans laid out on paper. Elias lived in a world governed by the curve of the earth and the whim of the sky. They could not understand him, and so they mocked him. Elias paid them no mind. He loaded his wagon, spoke a quiet word to Copper, and headed for Miller's Knoll. He had work to do. The work was brutal, a relentless contest between one man's will and the unyielding Dakota soil. He did not simply start digging. He spent the first week studying the knoll, observing the path of the sun, the patterns of the wind. He chose the north-facing slope precisely because it was the most protected. The prevailing winter winds came screaming out of the northwest. The hill itself would be his primary windbreak. Furthermore, the southern slope would catch the sun, and snow would drift against it, creating an even greater insulating barrier on the side of the hill he intended to occupy. He began the excavation not with a shovel, but with a plough. He hitched Copper to a heavy, single-bladed prairie plough and carved the outline of his future home into the tough sod. Then the real labor began. He used a drag scraper, a simple but effective tool. He would dig into the hillside with a pick and shovel, loosening the dense clay and stone, then guide Copper to pull the scraper forward, hauling a load of earth away from the cut. It was a slow, punishing rhythm. Dig, scrape, haul, dump. Repeat. The sun beat down on his back. His muscles screamed in protest. Days bled into weeks. The shallow cut deepened, becoming a trench, then a cavernous opening in the earth. The pile of excavated soil grew into a small mountain. The townsfolk, who sometimes rode out to gawk at his progress, saw a man carving a scar into the land. They saw madness. Elias saw the foundations of a sanctuary. Once he had dug 20 feet deep and 30 feet wide into the hillside, he started on the foundation. He hauled countless loads of flat, heavy field stones from a creek bed 2 miles away. He laid them without mortar, a dry stacked foundation that was an art form he had learned from an old stonemason in Santa Fe. He fitted each stone perfectly, using a hammer to chip away imperfections. This method, he knew, was superior to a mortared wall in this climate. It allowed the minuscule shifts of the ground during freezes and thaws without cracking, and it permitted groundwater to weep through and drain away, preventing it from pooling and turning his home into a muddy cellar. Water was the silent enemy of any structure built into the earth. The rear and side walls were the earth itself, sheer and solid. For the front-facing wall, he used massive cottonwood logs he had felled and seasoned himself over the previous winter. He worked them with a broad axe and an adze, hewing the round logs into square beams that would fit together with minimal gaps. He notched the corners with a precision that would have impressed any master carpenter, creating interlocking joints that were immensely strong. The gaps that remained, he chinked with a mixture he made himself: sticky blue clay from the creek bank, sand, and dried prairie grass for a binder. When it dried, it was nearly as hard as stone. The roof was the heart of his design, the element that earned him the most ridicule. He laid a dozen thick logs, each a foot in diameter, across the span of the excavation, their ends resting on the top of the front log wall and set into deep notches cut into the earth at the back. Atop this primary frame, he laid a dense layer of smaller, debarked poles, fitting them tightly together. On this wooden deck, he spread a thick mat of prairie hay, a full foot of it, creating a pocket of trapped air that would serve as his main insulation. Paragraph. Next came the waterproofing. He had traded for several large, cured bison hides, tough as leather and naturally water-repellent. He laid these over the hay, overlapping them like giant shingles, ensuring any moisture that seeped through the top layer would be shed to the sides. The final step was to return the earth to its home. Using the winch and scraper, he painstakingly moved the mountain of excavated soil onto the roof, covering the entire structure with a 2-foot-thick layer of packed dirt and sod. He carefully transplanted the prairie grass from the original sod layer back onto the roof. By the time he was finished, from any distance, his home had vanished. It was once again part of the knoll, a gentle, grass-covered slope that betrayed nothing of the space within. His chimney was a work of engineering in itself. He built it of stone, with a wide, stable base that rose through a carefully cut hole in the roof structure. He knew a simple pipe would be a disaster, prone to downdrafts that would fill the cabin with smoke or, worse, get ripped away by the wind. His stone chimney was a fortress, tapering as it rose, and he capped it with a large, flat stone supported by 4 smaller ones, a design that would keep out rain and snow while encouraging a steady draw. The interior flue was plastered smooth with clay, ensuring efficient airflow. It drew perfectly, pulling smoke up and out with a satisfying whisper. Inside, the space was a single large open room. The stone fireplace and hearth he built into the back wall were the focal point. To one side, he built a small partitioned stall for copper, sharing a common wall with the main living area. The horse's body heat would provide a small but constant source of extra warmth. He constructed a simple sleeping platform, a heavy table, and sturdy shelves from the leftover lumber. In the very back, he dug deeper into the earth, creating a small root cellar where the temperature would remain a constant cool, perfect for storing potatoes, carrots, and other provisions. His final piece of foresight was ventilation. He knew an airtight shelter could be a tomb, slowly filling with stagnant, unbreathable air. He engineered 2 vents. The intake was a 4-inch pipe set low in the front wall near the floor, baffled on the outside to prevent snow from blowing in directly. It would draw in the heavier, cold, fresh air. The outlet was another pipe, set high on the back wall near the ceiling to allow the warmer, stale air to rise and escape. This created a slow, constant, and almost unnoticeable circulation of fresh air, a critical detail that every one of his mockers in their drafty wooden houses had overlooked. By late autumn, the work was done. He had spent the last month stockpiling. The root cellar was full. Sacks of flour, beans, cornmeal, and salt were stacked against one wall. He had crates of ammunition for his rifle, tins of kerosene, and a barrel of salted beef. For copper, he had a dozen bales of hay and sacks of oats. And the firewood. He had cut and stacked cords of seasoned oak and cottonwood, enough to last through the longest winter he could imagine.
He stacked it inside, along the walls, where it would stay dry and also add to the insulation. Thorn's Folly was complete. It was not a house. It was a system for survival. As the first cold snaps of winter arrived, Elias settled into a quiet routine. His life in the Earth Lodge was comfortable, peaceful. The mockery from the town had faded to a background hum of accepted foolishness. When he rode into Prairie Ridge for mail or the few supplies he couldn't produce himself, he was met with knowing smirks and shakes of the head. The children would sometimes point and whisper, "There's the mole man." Sheriff Brody would just give him a tired look, as if disappointed that Elias insisted on continuing his eccentric charade. Elias ignored it all. He had grown accustomed to the solitude of his own convictions. He felt the change in the land long before the weather turned. There was a deep, resonant quiet to the plains. The coyotes, usually vocal at dusk, were silent. He found squirrels' nests packed so tightly with nuts and seeds they seemed ready to burst. The migration of the geese had been a month earlier than usual, a frantic, disorganized flight south. These were the signs he had learned to read, the subtle language of a world preparing for a siege. The sky began to tell its own stories. The sunsets were no longer fiery oranges and reds, but pale, sickly yellows with an unsettling greenish tinge at the edges. The air, even on calm days, had a sharp, biting quality that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was a clean, sterile cold, as if the world had been scoured. Copper grew more and more restless. He would pace in his stall, his ears twitching, sometimes staring at the solid back wall as if he could hear something far off in the deep earth. One afternoon, a week before the storm, an unnerving warmth settled over the prairie. The temperature rose 20 degrees in an hour. The sky was a high, thin sheet of milky white, and the sun was a hazy, indistinct disk behind it. There was no wind. The silence was absolute. Elias stood outside his lodge, feeling the strange, humid air on his face. He recognized it immediately. It was a weather breeder, a false peace, a gathering of energy for a spectacular and violent release. He spent the next 3 days in a state of final, quiet preparation. He re-chinked a few small gaps in the log wall. He brought the last of his cut firewood inside. He double-checked the security of the chimney cap and the vent baffles. He topped off his water barrels from the well. He was ready. He had done all he could. Now, all that was left was to wait for the war to begin. Inside the shelter, the storm was a distant rumor. The titanic fury that was scouring the world outside was reduced to a low, continuous rumble, the sound of a faraway ocean. The earth and sod above them drank the sound,
leaving only a profound sense of peace.
The fire in the stone hearth crackled and danced, casting a warm, flickering light across the room. A kettle of water simmered on the hob, letting out a gentle hiss. In his stall, Copper crunched contentedly on a ration of oats, his anxiety gone, replaced by the simple comfort of a full belly and a warm, safe shelter. Elias walked over to a small thermometer he had nailed to one of the log beams. It read 65 degrees. He tried to imagine the temperature outside. 40 below zero, perhaps 50. Add to that a wind of 70 miles an hour, and the cold became an abstract, unthinkable thing. It was a cold that did not just freeze water, but could freeze a man's lungs. A cold that could shatter steel. Here, inside his earthen womb, it was a pleasant autumn evening. The days blurred. With no windows, the passage of time was marked only by the hands of his pocket watch and the rhythm of his chores. He would tend the fire, feed Copper, cook his simple meals, and check his supplies. He could feel the weight of the snow piling up on the roof. Occasionally, the great log beams would emit a low groan as they settled under the immense, ever-increasing load. But they were thick and strong, and the structure was sound. The earth held. The arch held. The design held. He was not merely surviving the storm. He was living comfortably through it, a testament to the simple, powerful logic of his design. On what his watch told him was the morning of the third day, a new sound intruded upon his quiet world. It was a faint, frantic thumping, almost lost in the deep bass rumble of the wind that still moaned around his chimney. At first he thought it was a beam settling, but it came again, rhythmic and desperate. It was a knock on his door. He rose and unbarred the heavy plank door. It wouldn't budge. He put his shoulder to it and pushed. It gave way a few inches with a grinding scrape. A solid wall of snow, packed as hard as ice by the wind, had drifted completely over the entrance. He pushed with all his might, grunting with the effort, and finally managed to open it a foot. A figure collapsed through the opening, falling onto the stone floor in a cloud of fine, powdery snow. It was a man, his face a mask of ice, his beard frozen solid. Elias dragged him fully inside and slammed the door against the pressing drift. He rolled the man over. It was his neighbor, John Miller. "Help!" Miller croaked, his voice a raw whisper. "My family. The house." Elias wasted no time. He stripped off Miller's frozen coat and wrapped him in a thick wool blanket, sitting him close to the fire. He ladled a mug of hot broth and pressed it into the man's trembling hands. The story came out in gasps, between shivering fits. Their new house, the one with the big glass windows and the tall roof, had become a trap. The wind had shattered the windows on the north side first. They had boarded them up, but the wind found every crack. The cold was relentless. Their stove, a modern cast-iron model, devoured their firewood, but the heat was sucked out as fast as it was produced. Worse, the wind howling over the roof created a downdraft in their stovepipe, repeatedly extinguishing the fire and filling the house with smoke. Now, the roof was groaning under a terrible weight of snow. They were freezing, huddled in a single room, and they were terrified the house would collapse on top of them. Elias listened, his expression unchanging. He had foreseen all of it. He stood up, pulled on his own heavy coat and boots, and grabbed a coil of rope from a peg on the wall. He tied one end to the iron door handle. "Stay here. Keep the fire going," he told Miller. He opened the door and plunged into the white hell. The world was a maelstrom of screaming wind and blinding horizontal snow. Visibility was less than 5 feet. He couldn't see the sky. He couldn't see the ground. He was in the heart of the blizzard. Paying out the rope, he fought his way toward where he knew Miller's house stood. The wind shoved and clawed at him, trying to knock him down, to steal his breath, to freeze the very blood in his veins. He kept his head down and moved, one agonizing step at a time. The rope was his only link to safety. He found the house, or what was left of it. It was half buried in a massive drift, the windward side plastered with a thick shell of ice. He found the door and kicked it open. Inside was a scene of desperation. Mary Miller and her 2 small children were huddled under a pile of blankets and rugs, their faces pale, their lips blue. The air was frigid. He could see his breath as if he were still outside. The rescue was a nightmare. He took the youngest child first, a boy of 4, wrapping him inside his own coat and carrying him against his chest. He followed the rope back, a lifeline in the roaring chaos. He delivered the boy to his father, then turned and went back into the storm. He brought the daughter next, and finally he half-carried, half-dragged Mary, who was weak with cold and fear. Each trip was a monumental struggle against the elements. When the last of them was safely inside, Elias secured the door and collapsed, his body aching, his lungs burning. He had saved them. Thorn's folly had become Miller's refuge. They sat by the fire, wrapped in his blankets, the shame on John Miller's face slowly being replaced by a look of profound, life-altering awe. The storm raged for 2 more days, but inside the Earth Lodge, life went on. The Miller children, after recovering from their ordeal, looked around with wide-eyed wonder at the cozy, cave-like home. They were warm. They were safe. They listened to the distant moan of the wind and felt nothing but security. John Miller rarely spoke. He just watched Elias, a man he had openly mocked, a man who had just walked through the apocalypse to save his family. On the 5th day, an unfamiliar sensation settled over the lodge. It was silence. The deep, resonant rumble of the wind had ceased. Elias waited an hour, then 2, to be certain it was not just a lull. The silence held. The storm was over. He opened the door. The wall of snow was still there, but the pressure of the wind was gone. He grabbed a shovel. He had to dig his way out, carving a tunnel upwards through a drift that was more than 10 feet deep. When he finally broke through the surface, he was blinded by the light. The world was remade. It was a pristine, brilliant landscape of white, sculpted by the wind into fantastic waves and dunes. The sky was a piercing, cloudless blue. The air was crystalline and still. But the beauty was deceptive. It was the beauty of a graveyard. He looked toward the town. Prairie Ridge was gone. It was buried. Here and there, the peak of a roof or the top of a chimney poked through the snow, forlorn markers of a vanished world. He looked over at the Millers' homestead. The house was no longer there. The roof had collapsed entirely, leaving only a jagged pile of splintered lumber sticking out of a deep snowdrift. Had they stayed, they would have been crushed and frozen. Elias and John Miller, now recovered, made their way toward the town. The journey was arduous, wading through waist-deep snow. The scale of the devastation was absolute. They passed a neighbor's cabin, a dark scorch mark staining the snow around it. The stove must have overturned, the house burning down in the middle of the blizzard. They found other homes crushed flat. The blizzard of '88 had not just been a storm. It had been an act of judgment. They found a small group of survivors huddled in the wreckage of the general store, its roof partially caved in.
Faces were grim, etched with shock and grief.
When Elias walked in, a hush fell over the room.
These were the same people who had laughed at him, who had called him a fool. Now they stared at him as if he were a ghost. Sheriff Brody was there, his left arm in a crude sling, his face gaunt. He saw Elias and pushed himself to his feet. He walked over, his boots crunching on the debris-strewn floor. He stopped directly in front of Elias, and the entire room watched. "Thorn," Brody said, his voice raspy. "My house." The roof gave way. My wife and I were lucky to get out. He looked down at his ruined boots, then back up, meeting Elias's eyes directly. There was no condescension left in him, no arrogance. There was only the raw humility of a man who had stared into the abyss and been found wanting. "I was wrong," the sheriff said, his voice clear and steady for all to hear. "We were all of us wrong. And you were right." The apology was stark, simple, and complete.
It was an admission not just of a failed judgment, but of a failed understanding of the world they lived in. In the weeks of recovery that followed, Elias Thorn became the most important man in Prairie Ridge. He did not seek the role, but it was thrust upon him. The survivors, having lost everything, came to him not for charity, but for knowledge. He showed them. He walked them over his land, explaining the logic of his shelter. He taught them about windbreaks and snowdrifts, about the insulating power of the earth, about the vital importance of ventilation. He showed them how to build with the land, not just on it. They listened now. They listened with the rapt attention of students who had failed a deadly examination and were being given a second chance. Years passed. The town of Prairie Ridge was rebuilt, but it was a different town. The houses were lower, sturdier. Many were built into the south-facing slopes of hills, using the very principles Elias had demonstrated. The memory of the Great Blizzard was seared into the community's soul, a brutal lesson in the price of arrogance. Thorn's Folly, as it was once mockingly called, became known throughout the territory as Thorn's Refuge. It stood as a local landmark, a testament to the quiet man who had seen the truth when no one else would. In the winter of 1903, when another, lesser blizzard swept through, the old Earth Lodge saved the lives of a dozen stranded travelers. Elias lived out his days on his homestead, a man apart, yet deeply respected. He never once said, "I told you so." He never had to. The continued existence of his neighbors was statement enough. His vindication was not in their words of apology, but in the sight of their children playing in the sun, in the sturdy, sensible homes they built, in the hard-won wisdom that had replaced their scorn. On a warm summer evening, many years later, an old man sat on a bench outside his grass-roofed home. His hand rested on the greying muzzle of an ancient horse named Copper, who stood patiently beside him. Together, they watched the sun dip below the horizon, painting the vast Dakota sky in hues of orange and purple. The wind whispered through the prairie grass, but now it was a gentle, soothing sound. The line between madness and wisdom, Elias knew, was often drawn by the weather. He had been called a fool for listening to the land, but the land had spoken a truth older and more powerful than any human opinion, and he had been wise enough to build his life around it.